Joe Robleski has made a number of presentations to us, especially about things that happened in New Jersey during the period of the American Revolution. And he's also written, I think, about over a dozen articles for the Journal of the American Revolution. And some of these things are really fascinating, especially a couple of his most recent articles. He wrote about Annis Boudinot Stockton, a poetess, sister, I believe, of Elias Boudinot and husband of the or wife rather of the signer of the Declaration of Independence, Richard Stockton. And then he also wrote an article just recently about Governor William Franklin and the Indians, which was really a fascinating read. So I suggest you go to the Journal of the American Revolution when you have a chance and look at some of Joe's articles. Joe earned his PhD in education from Temple University in 1987, worked for a number of years for the Philadelphia School District in a variety of capacities. And since his retirement, he is a docent at Morven when he's not busy, writing articles for the Journal of the American Revolution. So with that, I am going to turn this over to our friend, Joe Robleski. Are you ready, Joe?
We're going to start with Return to New Jersey. Second Battle of Trenton and the March to Princeton. I will not be doing the Battle of Princeton. I'll save that for someone else. The picture of the statue you see in the corner there is the statue of Washington crossing the Delaware. It was sculpted by this man, Mahone Dickerson Eyre. Today, it's located in Mill Hill Park in Trenton. The statue itself was created for the Revolutionary Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876. The city of Trenton bought it in 1892, and they had placed it in Cadwalader Park. And then in 1976, for the bicentennial, they placed it where it, as I said, is presently located in Mill Hill Park. One of the sad things, in 2014, if you go online to look at, the history of this statue, you'll see it was defaced. Someone painted the hands of Washington red. And then just this past September, the base of the statue was defaced too. So it seems it's going along with whatever is going on. Okay, we're going to have a quick introduction. Let's see.
December 1776. Spirits are low in the Continental Army, but on Christmas night, George Washington famously crosses the Delaware River and falls upon a Hessian garrison at Trenton and wins the First Battle of Trenton. He recrosses back into Pennsylvania at that point, and American independence is achieved, right? Not remotely. Washington will, in fact, soon after recross the Delaware back into New Jersey and take position at Trenton along Assunpink Creek. He's going to have his men begin to construct earthworks there to confront the British. But the enlistments of many of Washington's men are about to expire, and Washington will make an appeal to his men. If you will stay 1 month longer, you will render that service to your country that might not be possible under any other circumstance. And soon after, one man steps forward to answer the call, and then another, till basically all of Washington's men are staying with him, getting ready to fight. And the result of that will be the Second Battle of Trenton, fought along Assunpink Creek. Now, facing the Americans will be Lord Charles Cornwallis, who has 8,000 men in Princeton, New Jersey. He's going to detach 5,500 of those soldiers and march them south toward Trenton to confront George Washington. Washington, of course, has expected this. He's going to send a contingent out under Colonel Edward Hand, and Hand's men take position between the two forces at a place called 5 Mile Creek. The British have to deploy to deal with Hand's men, and Hand and his soldiers fall back from 5 Mile Creek, but behind every rock, behind every tree, they are peppering the British, slowing the British advance by hours before they can even approach the town of Trenton. As Hand's men begin to fall back, Washington sends more troops out, Rhode Islanders. They joined Hand's men in the streets, and it further slows the British at that point. And there's only about an hour of daylight left by the time the British finally confront the American position along Assunpink Creek. And when Hand's men and the Rhode Islanders fell back across the creek, there they see an inspiring sight. George Washington, astride astride his horse, inspiring his men. And the men gather around him. They are strong when the British, the strongest military power on the face of the earth, attack the American line. And the Americans hold. Through a bloody exchange of small arms, of artillery fire, the Americans hold. The British fall back. They attack again. The same thing happens. But the Americans are starting to suffer some losses at this point. George Washington will order up his reserve, 1,800 militiamen under the command of John Cadwallader. Cadwallader brings his men forward. The British attack again, and this third attack is particularly bloody. The Americans repulse the British just like they had before, and the bridge is red with blood at that point. Cornwallis is disappointed he has not won, but is confident he will win in the morning. And at daylight, he will attack and has no doubt the Americans will be there. But George Washington has other plans. After the fighting ended, he takes a look and sees the Sawmill Road, a road that will allow him to fall upon the other British garrison at Princeton, New Jersey. So when Cornwallis arrays for battle the next morning, he goes and sees Americans over there, but it's just an artillery screen. The artillery opens up, but George Washington is long gone. He takes the Sawmill Road. He marches to Princeton, New Jersey, where he will win his first great victory over British regular soldiers in the field. And these soldiers, these citizen soldiers who had already left their farms and families, who had stayed beyond their terms of enlistment, decided to fight. They fought for what they believed in, and they fought for the hope that maybe by fighting at places like Second Trenton, American independence could take root.
Okay, so any questions? No, I just used that from the Battlefields Preservation Group as an introduction. I'm going to go into a lot more detail of what Mr. Edelman had spoken about. All right, so now we're going to start off with times that try men's souls. Following the Patriots' glorious 4th, they were to encounter a disastrous summer and autumn. August 26, 1776, the first major defeat for the Americans was at Brooklyn Heights, also known as Battle of Long Island. Continuous defeats for the Continentals culminating with the surrender of Fort Washington and abandonment of Fort Lee. So Washington's armies continued to retreat south. He set his headquarters up in Trenton on December 2nd, 1776. He crossed the Delaware on December 8th and set his headquarters in Bucks County in the town of Morrisville at a place called Somerset. With all the boats for miles, both north and south of Trenton having been commandeered by Washington, General Howe decided to go into winter quarters. The British established outposts at Elizabethtown, New Brunswick, Princeton, Trenton, Bordentown, and Burlington. Elizabethtown today is known as Elizabeth, New Jersey. And Washington's retreat across New Jersey. So on this map, it's taken from the Marine Corps Association, their 9 days that changed the world. One other warning I have to give the folks, especially from not familiar with the Trenton area. I'm going to be very Trenton-centric in naming places and things like that. Also, if you have any questions, we don't take questions during the talk, but you might want to jot some questions down. Then at the end, we open it up for questions and discussion. Okay, just at this map, we see the different dates where Washington's army was heading south. As we said, December 2nd, they entered Trenton. And on the 8th, they crossed the Delaware. Washington was with the last group to cross into Pennsylvania. Now, we all know about the miracle on Christmas, 1776. This painting by Mort Kunstler from 2011, some historians refer to it as probably the most accurate way, the means that Washington had crossed the Delaware. The First Battle of Trenton, Thursday, December 26, 1776. In doing this presentation and doing the research, it dawned on me, I never knew what day of the week the Battle of Trenton took place. We always talk about Christmas night, next day, but it happened to be on a Thursday. And in the introduction that I gave you, you saw this painting. It was by this artist, McMarron, for the United States Army Center, Military History. Here's another painting referring to the First Battle of Trenton, where Washington is inspecting the colors of the Hessian troops from 1914. Now, once Trenton was taken and approximately 900 Hessian prisoners were secured, it was decided to return to Pennsylvania. according to Joseph Reed. Now, Joseph Reed, I'm going to be mentioning his name a lot. I'll talk a little bit more about him in the next slide, but this is his report. The enemy was in force both above and below vis-a-vis Princeton and Bordentown. There were great quantities of spirituous liquors at Trenton, of which the soldiers drank too freely to admit discipline or the defense in the case of an attack. So they found a large Hessian liquor supply, and they, as it said, had imbibed. The stroke being brilliant and successful, it was not prudent or politic even to risk the chance of losing the advantages to be derived. Again, I'm quoting from Reed, so that's why I use the other spellings. All right, who is this Joseph Reed? Washington's aide-de-camp secretary and adjutant general. Little bit about Joseph Reed. Now, Joseph Reed was born in Trenton, and he attended the College of New Jersey. For folks that don't know this, the College of New Jersey was the original name for Princeton University. And then he studied law under Richard Stockton. As Bob had mentioned earlier, Richard Stockton was one of the 5 signers of the Declaration of Independence from New Jersey. And Reed went to Philadelphia, where he began his law practice. 1775, he was commissioned a lieutenant colonel in the Continental Army. He became an aide-de-camp and secretary to General Washington. Eventually, March 1776, he was appointed Washington's adjutant general. The best description I can give of what I read about what an adjutant general is, if this was a private company and Washington was the CEO, the adjutant general is the COO, the chief operating officer. He makes sure all of the paperwork and all the minutia that is needed to keep an army going or whatever level, that's what the adjutant general is responsible for. An interesting thing, he had a falling out with Washington after Washington had opened a letter that General Lee had sent to Reed. And in this letter, Washington was being criticized by Lee. And as I said, they had a falling out. Reed stayed on during the battles of Trenton, Princeton, but resigned his post 3 weeks after Princeton. He returned to Philadelphia and he entered politics. He was elected to Congress and also became the president of the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania. That would be their equivalent of their state legislature. After the war, he renewed his law practice, but he died in 1785 at the age of 44. So as I said, Reed will be mentioned quite a few times. Washington's headquarters in Newtown, Pennsylvania. He stayed at this place called the Widow Hannah's house on Sycamore Street, Newtown. And he was there December 27th through the 29th. Here's a rendering of the widow's house. And the original house was torn down in 1964. Now, what's on this property today? A Luck oil station. And if you're not familiar with Luck Oil, they're headquartered in Moscow, Russia. It's a Russian oil company. And also a little note, it was reported that when George Washington was leaving, he gave Mrs. Harris a silver tea set as a thank you. Now, after the Battle of Trenton, what did the Hessians do? Remember, they weren't just in Trenton. They were along the river. They were in Bordentown. They were in Burlington and Mount Holly. So following the report of the defeat of the Hessians, Trenton's Colonel Carl von Donop, who was the overall commander of all Hessian troops along the Delaware, abandoned Burlington and Bordentown. He retreated to Allentown and Crosswicks and was ordered on to report to Princeton on December 28, 1776. Here's a painting of Colonel von Donop. So his full name was Colonel Carl Emil Count von Donop of Hesse Castle. And he was killed in the Battle of Red Bank, New Jersey, October 1777. Red Bank was one of the forts on the Jersey side that was built to stop British troops from coming up to Delaware. Well, we know they went south through Chesapeake and came up the back way, but they were still a pain and they had to be taken out. And the Hessians under Dunlap led the attack, and he was killed in that attack. A little bit more about Colonel Reed. Now, he was sent out to find the disposition of Pennsylvania troops. If you remember back to the plan for the first Battle of Trenton, Washington was going to cross, and also British or Pennsylvania militia under General Ewing was supposed to cross from Marsville into Trenton to block the Hessians there. And General Cadwalader was supposed to cross into Burlington to complete the trap. But we know those two groups couldn't get across at that time. However, on December 27, Colonel John Cadwalader, commander of the 3rd Battalion of Philadelphia Associators, Pennsylvania's militia were called Associators, and the Philadelphia Light Horse and Colonel Daniel Hitchcock's brigade of New England Continentals, along with 2 companies of artillery, had now crossed the river from Bristol to Burlington, New Jersey. Eventually, he established his headquarters in Crosswicks, New Jersey. He sent word to Washington that the Hessians had abandoned all their posts along the Delaware. And Colonel Reed, who was sent out by Washington to find out what these troops were doing, he verified the reports. Here's a painting drawing of Cadwalader. Colonel John Cadwalader, he was also born in Trenton. So as I said, Reed was born in Trenton, Cadwalader was there. He moved to Philadelphia just like Reed did. It was interesting. Twice he was offered brigadier generalships in the Continental Army. He turned them both down and remained with the Pennsylvania militia. And when he wasn't with the militia, he served as an aide to Washington, an unpaid aide. And in 1778, you probably heard of the cabal, the Conway cabal that tried to overthrow Washington. Well, Cadwalader challenged Conway to a duel and ended up shooting Conway in the mouth. Conway didn't die from it, but it ended the plans to replace Washington. Also crossing at Burlington was Brigadier General Thomas Mifflin. If you go to Pennsylvania or Philadelphia, there's Fort Mifflin. It was named after this General Thomas. Brigadier Thomas Mifflin had been the first quartermaster general of the Continental Army. Then starting on December 27th through the 29th, his command of Continentals crossed the Delaware also at Bristol. He joined Cadwalader at Crosswicks, and according to Washington, these two forces amount to around 3,600 men. Mifflin went on to establish his own headquarters at Bordentown, and he was promoted to Major General after the Battle of Princeton. One thing about numbers, I've read a lot of books in doing this presentation, and everybody comes up with different numbers for both the British and the Americans in the Second Battle of Trenton and the Princeton. So like I said, whatever numbers I give, they're an estimate. Now, recrossing the Delaware, with the information that the Hessians had abandoned their posts along the Delaware and American troops were in New Jersey, Washington called a council of war on December 27th to review their options. So a council, usually with this would be with the generals and other leading officers, field officers, to decide what to do. Now, according to Joseph Reed, some doubts, it is said, arose in the General Council on this occasion. Some of the members to return, but the general, that would be Washington, and some others declared that though they would not have advised the movement yet being done, it ought to be supported, and orders were accordingly issued for the troops to prepare to cross the river. Recrossing the Delaware due to weather and ice on the river proved to be more difficult than it did on Christmas night, taking 2 days before the Army was back in New Jersey, December 29th and the 30th. It's interesting at this point, two of the more important regiments that fought in the first Battle of Trenton did not decide to go back to Jersey. Their time was coming up. Remember, on January 1st, all the Continental troops enlistments would be up. And an important unit, the John Glover's Marblehead Mariners, the 14th Massachusetts Continental Regiment, who played a big role in getting the troops across. They decided they were not going to re-enlist. Rather, they would go back home and take part in the more lucrative endeavor of privateering. Again, many of these men had been fishermen, mariners up in Massachusetts. Another regiment was John Hazlitt's 1st Delaware Regiment. The overwhelming majority did not want to re-enlist, and as a result, there were only 6 members of this regiment left that took part in the Second Battle of Trenton. It was Colonel Hazlitt, 2 of his officers, a surgeon, and only 2 privates. Okay, now where did they cross? So these are the ferry crossings from Pennsylvania into New Jersey or in the Trenton area. Washington and Major General John Sullivan's divisions recrossed at McConkey's Ferry. The other division commander, Major General Nathaniel Greene, his division crossed at Yardley. Brigadier General James Ewing's brigade of Pennsylvania, New Jersey militia, they crossed at the Trenton Ferry. Again, this is Ewing's brigade. They were supposed to cross at Christmas night and come in south of Trenton, but they weren't able to cross then, but they were able to cross at this point. For people who are familiar with the Trenton area, there is a township just outside of Trenton called Ewing Township. I originally thought that this was named after General James Ewing, but really it was named after a man named Charles Ewing, who was a Supreme Court Justice of the New Jersey Chief Justice of New Jersey Supreme Court in the 1820s. Again, this James Ewing, he was from the Lancaster area in Pennsylvania. And then finally, as I mentioned, John Cadwalder and General Mifflin, they crossed at the Chamonix and Dunk's Ferry and crossed into the Burlington area. A little look at who the division commanders, again, as I mentioned, Nathaniel Greene. And here's a etch of Sullivan. Now, we all have heard of Brigadier General William Alexander, who became Major General, better known as Lord Sterling. He remained in Newtown with the rear guard. He had been ill, even was ill at the first Battle of Trenton, so he did not take part in the second. Now, the main problem that Washington was facing at this time was that on January 1st, 1777, the enlistments of the Continental troops were up. So what was he going to do? Well, the solution came thanks to Brigadier General Thomas Mifflin. He offered his Pennsylvania troops and Hitchcock's New England Brigade a $10 bounty if they agreed to stay on for a few more weeks. Most of them agreed. And I was interested in what does a private in the Continental Army get as a pay. The pay back then was $6 a month. So $10 was not a bad bonus for staying on a few more weeks. Washington used the same incentive for the men in Trenton. It took 2 pleas. The first time he asked anybody who wants to stay on for the bonus, take 1 step forward. Nobody came forward. And he was kind of distraught. And then he asked the second time, and then most of those agreed. And Robert Morris of Philadelphia was able to raise $50,000 from friends in Philadelphia on his own credit and his private funds. And when I say 50,000, talking hard currency, not the continental dollars, because the soldiers weren't going for that. Here's a painting of Robert Morris. So he was a financier. He was named to the Continental Congress 1775 from Pennsylvania. He founded the Bank of Pennsylvania, and in 1781, Congress named him Superintendent of Finance. And as you see, it said he died in 1806 at the age of 72. Now, the stunned response of the British to the victory at Trenton. Major General James Grant, overall commander of British forces in New Jersey, he had his headquarters in New Brunswick. He arrived at Princeton on the morning of January 1st. Why this General Grant was in charge, originally it was Cornwallis, but we'll talk more about that. Cornwallis was getting ready to go back to England, and they named Grant overall, but we see what's going to happen. So Lieutenant General Charles Lord Cornwallis arrived at Princeton on the evening of January 1st, 1777. His headquarters were set up at Morven, which was the home of, as we've mentioned a few times, Richard Stockton. With Grant and Cornwallis's forces, the total number of British and Hessian troops poised to march on Washington at Trenton numbered around approximately 8,000. Cornwallis informed his council of war that they would march in force to Trenton at daybreak on the King's Highway, or also known as the Post Road. Interestingly, Colonel von Dunlop offered an alternative plan: use two columns, one on the Post Road, and a second column taking the Old York Road, thereby coming up at the rear of the American forces. This would go through, again, for folks out of the area, I'm talking about places that are known locally, would be to Cranberry, Allentown, Crosswicks, and come up behind the Americans. Well, Cornwallis rejected this suggestion, preferring to strike the Americans in one stroke. Now, he wanted to show that we're going to crush these upstarts for what they did at Trenton. And who were the British commanders? A little look at them. Cornwallis. Now, Cornwallis had been given leave to travel to England to be with his sick wife. This was canceled, and he was ordered with to go to Washington at Trenton. And the general who was taking his place in Jersey was Major General Grant, Scotsman. And Grant was at Boston in 1775. He became an advisor to Howe. And reading about Grant, he was virulently anti-American. During the French and Indian War, his command got beat up on the Western Pennsylvania on the Forbes Road, and he blamed the Americans that they weren't doing what he said, whereas Grant really had no idea. And he was considered to be the most hated British officer in America during the Revolution. So what was Washington's plans for the defense of Trenton? Washington had received intelligence reports about the British in Princeton and its intended movements towards Trenton. They were getting, as I said, information, spies telling Washington what was going on. After reviewing his options, Washington decided that he couldn't defend the entire town. So he chose to set up a defensive line on the high ground on the southern bank of the Assunpink Creek. It had steep slopes. There was only a stone bridge crossing the creek at Queen Street. Here's a picture that I took of the Assunpink Creek from Mill Hill, looking downstream. Now, the Assunpink Creek, as I said, seen from Mill Hill, the name Assunpink is based on the Lenni Lenape term meaning stony water. Okay, American positions along the Assunpink, December 31st. The American line along the Assunpink extended for 3 miles from the Delaware River on the left, so here, to the Great Bear Swamp on the right. There were 2 fords on the right bank, Henry's Mill Ford and Phillips Mill Ford. So these are here. Again, there was only one bridge over the creek in Trenton at Queen Street. Today, Queen Street is South Broad Street. So again, for folks not familiar with the area. So this line extends, well, it's 3 miles to here. Now, living in Trenton all my life, this seems like a lot more than 3 miles. If you go from the Delaware River to what would be called Whitehead Road. And, but they measured it out, and it really is, because in those days, there were no buildings blocking it. Now, guarding the right flank, again, were these Henry Mill Ford. It's approximately 2 miles from the bridge, and General Mifflin had about 1,700 Philadelphia troops there. And this is a picture, approximately location of Henry's Mills. And again, if you're familiar with the Trenton area, it's where Mulberry Street comes in to meet Nottingham Way. And back in the old days, when I talk about growing up, De Laval, a company that made steam and turbines and things like that, were located there. The further way from the river was Phillips Mill. Again, it was approximately 3 miles from the Delaware, and this was General St. Clair's brigade of about 1,200 troops. Again, another picture, approximately location of Phillips Mill today is where Whitehead Road meets Sweetbriar. And it's, again, it seems a lot longer today. And again, these photos were taken by, from this Battles of Trenton, Princeton, 9 days that changed the war. The name down at the bottom, MCA, Marine Corps Association. I'll talk more about their book in a little while. So the key defense was Henry Knox had 30 to 40 pieces of artillery available. Much of it was set up to defend the bridge. The remainder of the pieces were set up to defend the 2 forts. General St. Clair's brigade, we talked about that, he was brought back to defend the bridge. The remainder of the troops were aligned 3 parallel lines stretching 3 miles from Delaware to the Great Swamp. So they were in 3 parallel lines. And again, anywhere from 6,000 to 7,000 men. And we see the numbers of the different brigades and divisions. Hitchcock Brigade had about 1,500 New Englanders. And there were about 1,000 militia. These would have been Ewing's militia. Now, a little bit about this man, Henry Knox. Brigadier General Henry Knox, commander of the Continental Artillery. He was the first commander of the Continental Artillery Regiment set up in 1775. Probably familiar with the story of bringing the cannons from Ticonderoga. The present day battle site. This is at Mill Hill Park. And when they have reenactments of the Battle of Trenton, usually it's the week between Christmas and New Year's. It's called Patriots Week. And this little bridge here, when they have the reenactments, that's where the British go over. However, the actual battle site is about maybe 100 yards to the left of this area. Now, a force of about 1,000 Continentals were sent to delay the British on the King's Highway. In order to buy time to deploy his troops, Washington had sent a delaying force on the King's Highway between Trenton and Princeton. This force consisted of Brigadier General Roche de Fourmoy's brigade. He was a French officer who was given a commission in the Continental Army. His brigade consisted of Charles Scott's 5th Virginia Regiment, Edward Hand's 1st Pennsylvania, Nicholas von Hussinger's Pennsylvania and Maryland German Battalion, and Captain Thomas Forrest's artillery. And again, these were all Continental regulars. Aside from this strong force of approximately 1,000 troops, the topography of the route with narrow roadway bordered by dense woodlands and crossed by 4 creeks, Stony Brook, 8 Mile Run, 5 Mile Run, and the Shabbaconk, allowed the Americans to set up several ambushes along the route. Also aiding the Patriot cause was Mother Nature. The temperatures rose above freezing. If you look up, you see it's around 50 degrees at the high of the day, turning the road into a muddy quagmire that significantly slowed the British Army's progress, particularly their artillery and their wagons. So the British march to Princeton. Again, let's take a look at this. So up here, number 1, at daybreak, Cornwallis began his march to Trenton, leaving 1,200 men as a rear guard in Princeton under Colonel Charles Mulhood. Number 2 then left another 1,200 men at Maidenhead under General Alexander Leslie. Maidenhead today is known as Lawrenceville. at 3-mile run, a 5-mile run today, it's called the Little Shabbaconk, there was a bizarre incident took place. General de Fermoy, without a word to anyone, got on his horse and rode back to Trenton, leaving Colonel Edward Hand in command. When you read about this, they don't know why he did it. Speculation was that he might have been drunk and he didn't want to take part in the battle. And it worked out well. Colonel Hand was a very competent officer. Down number 4, the ambushes and sniping delayed the British, so it wasn't until 1 p.m. that they reached the Shabbaconk Creek, about 4 miles from the American positions on the Assunpink in Trenton. It was at the Shabbaconk that they held the British up for another 3 hours before the British could enter Trenton. And Stockton Hollow was the final obstacle of the British before they got to Trenton. If you go to Trenton today, if you go on a road known as Brunswick Avenue, about maybe a quarter mile, half mile before you enter Trenton, where the Battle Monument is, that's where Stockton Hollow is. And again, this map is taken from this Marine Corps thing. Let's take a look at some of the obstacles today from Google Earth, what they look like today. So the Stony Brook Bridge. In 1777, there was a bridge over the creek here. This is the main road coming out of Princeton. This is the King's Highway or the Post Road. And there was a mill right at this site. The bridge at Stony Brook, again, is about 2 miles from Nassau Hall. And back in these days, where the college was, Nassau Hall, that was basically where Princeton was. So this was originally a British outpost. So this is where they started their march. The first obstacle, as I mentioned, was a place called 8 Mile Run. And it was here that they began ambushing. Again, this was about 6 miles from Princeton. Today, this 8 Mile Run is called Shippentalkin Creek. And this road here, for people familiar with it, is called Flackler Road as you enter onto 206. Along the British route to Trenton, another obstacle was the 5 Mile Run, again, today known as Little Shabbaconk. And New Jersey, local governments, what have you, they've been putting up markers. And as you cross, this is on 206 heading into Trenton, you'll see this little marker as you cross the little bridge over the place. And it was put in by the township of Lawrence. So Lawrence, or Maidenhead, was the original name of what was Lawrence, what's today Lawrenceville. And the Shabbaconk Creek was where they were held up the longest. And today this sign or historic marker is under the command of Edward Hand. A successful delaying action fought along the Shabbaconk Creek, British forces from reaching Trenton before nightfall. And this marker is located on Lawrenceville Road, right in front of Notre Dame High School, high school that I attended back in the old days. And so this, again, this marker showing where this skirmish took place. So who were these soldiers? Who were they commanding the delaying force? The first one we talked about is 1st Pennsylvania Rifle Regiment, Colonel Edward Hand. In March of 1777, he was sent to Fort Pitt, and later in the war, he joined Lafayette's division, taking part in the Battle of Yorktown. The other one was Colonel Charles Scott. He was with the 5th Regiment, 5th Virginia Continental Regiment. And he fought in the Philadelphia campaign. He was captured in Charleston in May of 1780, and he went on to become the 4th governor of Kentucky. When I was getting these pictures, I said, they look like they could be brothers. They look a lot alike. And the artillery support, that played a key role. It was Captain Thomas Forrest, this gentleman here, of the 2nd Company of Pennsylvania Artillery Battalion. Forrest's company of 50 artillerymen, they had 2 6-pounder brass field pieces, 2 5.5-inch howitzers. They took part in the First Battle of Trenton, and they were assigned to provide support on this King's Highway. In June of 1777, the Pennsylvania Artillery Battalion under Colonel Thomas Proctor became the 4th Continental Artillery Regiment, and they took part in most engagements during the rest of the War of Independence. Captain Parker was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel in 1778. He resigned his commission in October of 81. And he went on to politics. He was elected to the 16th Congress as a Federalist from Pennsylvania. And as you see here, he died in 1825. The final barrier before Trenton is the Stockton Hollow. So by 4 p.m., with only 1 hour of daylight remaining, Cornwallis had pushed the Continentals back to Stockton Hollow, a small ravine about a half mile from the outskirts of Trenton. Washington, hoping to hold off the British until nightfall, rode out to the position and ordered as an obstinate a stand as could be made. Also joining him was General Greene, who also came up with reinforcements, and he immediately assumed command of the entire force. Nearly an hour went by before the Patriot defenders, unable any longer to hold, began to yield ground and retreat down the Brunswick Road to the village. By the time the British brought up artillery and overcame the barriers at Stockton Hollow, it was approaching 5 p.m. and getting dark. Sunset on January 2nd was at 4:49 p.m. It's amazing what you can find when you Google something today about almost any subject. I was curious as to when sunset was, and I found it. Interestingly, the British entered Trenton where the Americans on December 26 entered Trenton, and Alexander Hamilton had set up his battery at the head of King and Queen Street. And again, this area today, if you go to Trenton, you'll see a very large monument known as the Battle Monument of Trenton. So the British entered the assault on Queen Street Bridge. The British advance was forced the retreating Americans down Queen Street. Again, today, if you're familiar with Trenton, this is Broad Street. And another went down King Street. King Street today would be Warren Street, in hopes of cutting the Americans off. Upon approaching the bridge on Queen Street, Hitchcock's brigade was ordered across the bridge to provide cover for the retreating force. Once the retreating men were over the bridge, they also recrossed and took up defensive positions. Throughout this action, General Washington, on horseback, was overseeing the operations at the bridge. There he is, overseeing the operations. And if you read some of the diaries of the men there, they noted that Washington was exposed to danger, and by him doing this, he inspired his men with courage and confidence. Now, the assault on Queen Street Bridge. Here's a drawing about the assault on the bridge. As enemy troops approached the bridge, mainly they sent the Hessians in. A deadly artillery and musket fire drove the initial attempt back with heavy casualties. Washington, expecting more attacks, ordered the 5th and 6th Virginia regiments to hold the bridge at all costs. The British twice more tried to capture the bridge. However, in the face of artillery using canister shot and continued intensive musket fire, General Cornwallis called off the attacks. Again, here's a map of the area. This is taken from Larry Kidder's 10 Crucial Days, the map. Deployment of the forces. On the evening of January 2nd, Cornwallis called a council of war. General William Erskine urged an immediate attack. He didn't believe Washington would be there in the morning. General James Grant, we had mentioned him earlier, advised to wait for daylight. It was apparent that further attacks at night were not going to be successful, plus his troops were spent from the day's march. He then had picket lines set up facing the Americans on the Aspen Peak. So this is where the British picket lines are. And again, this paragraph is important that, remember, we talked about them slogging down the King's Highway the entire day. And Cornwallis knew that they were kind of spent, that they weren't going to be able to take part in the night attack. Cornwallis chose to wait for daylight. He planned to assault the fords on his left, not the bloody bridge. So he was going to attack Henry's Ford and Phillips Ford. Aside from the picket lines facing the Americans on the Assunpink, the bulk of his troops were out of artillery range around today what's called the Brunswick Traffic Circle. So he was set up in here. This was outside of artillery. Reportedly, this is when Cornwallis gave the quote above. "We got the old Fox safe now. We'll go over and bag him in the morning." When I say reputedly, some say he really didn't say it. It's like any other thing that comes down through tradition. Was this his true saying? So the disposition of the British troops at night. So again, as we see, here's the bridge. This is the Assunpink, and these were the British. This is where where Cornwallis and the main part of the army encamped that night. And if you want to see what it looks like today, you ride up on Brunswick Avenue and you come to this thing called the Brunswick Circle. It branches off. One road goes Route 1 to New Brunswick, and then the other roads coming in from Princeton come in through to this circle. Now, just like Cornwallis called the council of war, so did Washington. On the night of January 2nd, General Washington called another council of war to decide what should they do in the morning. They met at the home of Alexander Douglas, which had been serving as the headquarters of General Arthur St. Clair. Included in the council were his two division commanders, Sullivan and Greene. Also present were his artillery commander, Knox, along with Arthur St. Clair and General Hugh Mercer. They were brigade commanders. This is a photo of the Alexander Douglas house that where this meeting took place. The house has a very interesting history. The man, Mr. Douglas, goes on eventually to become one of the commissary generals of the American Army. The house at the time of the battle was located on South Broad Street, just above the creek. It was bought by a Lutheran church, served as a rectory. It was then moved to Center Street and eventually to Stacy Park along the Delaware. And eventually in 1972 was put on its present site on Front Street. If you think back to where I had that map, it's located now in Mill Hill Park. Now, what does Joseph Reed note took place in this council? The night of January 2nd was perhaps the most gloomy and anxious that of our revolutionary soldiers knew. From a military point of view, Washington's position was a false one, separated by a small, and as was ascertained by Adjutant General's observations, so Reed is talking about himself, a fordable creek from an enemy superior numbers, equipment, and discipline, and exasperated by recent discomfiture with a river impassable by floating ice in their rear. Washington and his generals could not but look with extreme solicitude to the chances of the next day. So what were the options available to this council? 1, meet the expected attack in the morning in the present defensive positions along the southern bank of the Assunpink. 2, abandon the line along the Assunpink and head south on the Bordentown Road to Burlington, then cross the Delaware and head to Philadelphia. 3, outflank the British on their left flank, then head to the British depot at New Brunswick via Princeton. As in most counts of war, Washington already had an idea what he was going to do, but he allowed his subordinates to present their points of view and opted for the one that he really wanted to do in the first place. The consensus of the council was to act on the third option, outflank the British left flank, attack Princeton, and then raid the depot at Brunswick. Washington himself describes this movement. One thing I was certain of, that it would avoid the appearance of a retreat, which was of consequence, or to run the hazard of the whole army being cut off, whilst we might, by a fortunate stroke, withdraw General Howe from Trenton and give some reputation to our arms. Happily, we succeeded. Once again, Mother Nature played a role. And this is described by Benson Losing. If you're familiar with Losing, he wrote travel books about the revolution in the early 1800s. And this is his description of what was going on that night. This proposition was approved, but the ground, on account of the thaw, was too soft to permit an easy transit of their 40 pieces of cannon. This was a serious difficulty. While the council was in session, the wind changed to the northwest and became so exceedingly cold that within 2 hours, the ground was as hard as a pavement. The great difficulty was overcome by the power mightier than that of man. The favorable moment was speedily improved. So again, this shift of wind, remember we said the British were held up because of the muddy thaw, and the Americans now are going to be helped by this quick freeze. Ruse de guerre, march to Princeton. Ruse de guerre is the term for a fake deception. The key to the success of this plan was to leave as quietly as possible on a little used back road to Princeton, of which his scouts had reported that the British did not patrol nor guard. A couple of men from the Hunterdon militia, Trenton in those days was part of Hunterdon County, and they knew the back roads. And so they were going to guide Washington's army on these roads. A key to the secrecy of this maneuver was to convince the British that the Americans were still in positions awaiting an expected attack in the morning. For this end, the rear guard of about 500 men were ordered to keep fires blazing, make noise using shovels and pickets, and improving the breastworks and moving sentinels about as would be expected at night. They had orders that about 3 hours after the main body of the army left, they would follow. Before the pullout of the main army convents, the baggage, along with wounded and sick, were sent south on the Bordentown Road to Burlington. So they didn't want to take their baggage and the wounded with them. And again, they were sent to Burlington with the idea would cross there and go to Philadelphia. Again, here's another map just to recount what we're talking about. So the old road, this was again the King's Highway. Today it's 206, also known as the Brunswick Pike. This road here that Benson Losing calls the Turnpike was another road coming out of Princeton. Today this is called the Princeton Pike. We see 8 Mile Run up here. This was the first site of the first American ambush. Maidenhead today is the little borough of Lawrenceville. 5 Mile Run, another ambush set up. This was the Little Shabbaconk today. And again, this is where the Fermoy ran away from. Here it's called the Shabbaconk Creek, or today it's spelled the Shabbaconk. And again, this is where the British were held up for 3 hours. Over here where it says Sandtown, this is Hamilton Township today. This is the back road that they're going to take to go to Princeton. So the end of the march to Princeton. They took this back road, and when they reached what was called, it was called the Quaker Road, because Quakers from Crosswicks went to meet with their friends at the Stony Brook meeting, just about a mile or so from here. And there was a 1-lane wooden bridge that the artillery couldn't get across, so they had to rebuild the bridge. And while it held the army up, it did play a good part because it gave like a 2-hour break where the soldiers could rest up. Because remember, for most of the night, they had been, sneaking out from Trenton down this road. So the modifications to the 18th century Quaker Bridge delayed the march, but it really didn't affect it too much. As a matter of fact, as I said, gave them some rest. And one of the key places here was the Stony Brook Meeting House. So this is the meeting house today. It's a historic landmark. And it was near where the Continentals were going to approach Princeton. So Washington Army approaches Princeton. So this is taken from Google Earth. So we see the armies converging here. About a half mile north of the Stony Brook crossing, that was the bridge we were talking about, they came to a fork in the road. So Sullivan's division to take this road, and it was called the Sawmill Road, and he was going to approach Princeton from the rear of Princeton. General Hugh Mercer, his brigade was at the lead of the Nathaniel Greene's division, they were taking the Quaker Road to first take over the bridge over the Stony Brook. We had seen that before, to block the British from coming back. We see when the first Battle of Trenton, there were like almost 800 men in Hugh Mercer's brigade. By this time, there's only 325. A lot of them, as I said, did not re-up. With orders to seize the bridge on the main road, as I said, for a double purpose, to intercept fugitives coming from Princeton and stop Cornwallis's main army from coming in. Again, this is a present-day view from thing. As I said at the beginning, I'm not going to go into the Battle of Princeton, but just some items from it. 2 leaders who died at Princeton. Brigadier General Hugh Mercer, he was a colonel of the 3rd Virginia Regiment. He was mortally wounded at Princeton on January 3rd. He died 9 days later. Mercer County, New Jersey is named after him. General John Hazlitt. Hazlitt, as I said, he was commissioned as colonel of the 1st Delaware Regiment. He, along with another officer, and as I said, only 6 of them stayed, he got shot in the head at the Battle of Princeton, and he died instantly. So of those only 6 men, the colonel died. Question: did you know that Continental Marines served at the Trenton and Princeton? I found this interesting. In December of 1776, Major Samuel Nicholas, 1st Commandant of the Marines, wrote to Congress, "I was ordered to march with 3 of my companies to be under the command of His Excellency, the Commander-in-Chief. The battalion of Marines under the command of Major Nicholas participated in the Battle of Princeton mainly as artillerymen. This was the first example of a battalion of Marines serving as actual fighting unit under the direct command of an Army authority." Also at Princeton were Pennsylvania State Marines, where a Captain William Shipman was killed. 11 of the 13 states had their own state navies with their own state Marines. New Jersey and Delaware were the only 2 states that didn't have a state navy. And so Captain Shipman was a Marine as part of the Pennsylvania State Navy. Following the Battle of Princeton, the Continental Marines went into Morristown winter quarters, where they were absorbed into the Continental Army, mainly as artillerymen. And this painting, Marines with Washington at Princeton, was painted by this Colonel Charles Waterhouse, a Marine. Now, epilogue. Washington's route to Princeton delineated with 12 granite obelisks. So now we're going to talk about how the Battle of Princeton and the march to Princeton was treated in history. So on March 14th, 1914, the New Jersey chapter Sons of the American Revolution ordered 12 Quincy granite obelisks to mark the route of the Continental Army took from Trenton to Princeton that night, January 3rd. Markers are 8 feet high, 1 foot, 6 inches on each side, with a bronze plaque 1 foot wide. This is a photo that I took of the first marker. It is located at the Cure Arena in Trenton. We have this large arena. It's had many names. Cure is now the sponsor. It's located at South Broad Street and Hamilton Avenue. So this was marker number 1. And on that bronze plaque, this is what is written: "The route of Washington's march by night from Trenton to Princeton in victory, January 3rd, erected in 1914. Here's a couple pictures of, there's 12 markers. And again, this one is located on Quaker Bridge Road. It's in a little medium next to this tree. This marker is the 11th one, and it's located in a cornfield just before you get to the Stony Brook Meeting House. Now, here's a list of the present day where the sites of these 12 markers are. And if you want to get see all 12 markers in situ to see where they're located, you can go to this site in Revolutionary War, New Jersey, click on Mercer County, then click on Trenton, and it'll bring up Revolutionary War sites. You go down to the Washington markers, and it will give you a photograph and tell you exactly where each of the markers are located. So again, you start here in Trenton at South Broad and Hamilton, and this ends at Thomas Clark, behind the Thomas Clark House at the Princeton battlefield. Postscript, immortalizing Washington after the Second Battle of Trenton. John Trumbull painted this of Washington's supposedly after, with the Second Battle of Trenton. Here we see General Washington in full military uniform, his blue coat over buff waistcoat and pants. He holds a spyglass in his right hand and a sword in his left. Behind him is Blueskin, his spirited light-colored horse restrained by a groom. Further in the distance is the bridge over the Assunpink and near the mill, along with artillery and campfire. So this was Trumbull's idea of what Washington looked like after the Second Battle of Trenton. Postscript, probably the best guide to the battles of Trenton. As I mentioned, we saw the pictures, is this document. You can find it online. It's the 9 days that changed the world. It's at Marine Corps Association, marinecorps.org. And in this, the author gives directions to each of the sites and tells you how to get there and what to expect to see.
I'm going to give you a couple of questions and comments from the chat, Joe, and then we'll open it up for everyone, and I'll ask everybody to unmute. Let me show you what we've got here. Hold on. There we go. So Mary Jane Meckling asked, where did Lord Stirling's troops go while he was at Newtown?
They were part of that rear guard action. They still want to protect that part of Bucks County and all in case something happened, and the Army had to get back to Pennsylvania and make sure the British couldn't get around them. So
Stirling's troops stayed in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Got it. Steve Rawling asks, well, he says, presumably Washington had his major supply dump somewhere west of the Delaware. He's guessing at Newtown, so everyone there may have just sat around and guarded the base. I think that's in response to what Mary Jane said.
Right.
That's what you know as well.
Right, and plus their main idea was they were going to, their main objective was to hit New Brunswick before the British caught up to them, because that was the main British supply post. And plus they had learned there was, I forget how many thousands of British pounds in gold was there. But by the time they got through with Princeton, they just headed up to Morristown. But, that was going to be their main supply to attack the British depot at New Brunswick.
Right. Roger Williams mentions that the Sawmill Road is further east, not on Mercer Street. So that's something you might want to look at.
Yeah, a few of these maps are not very good. It basically goes down where Hamilton Avenue and works its way up through the different parts. Again, it was only a dirt road back in those days, so the maps, nobody's really that accurate.
Roger, who also is very up on what's going on in the publishing world, tells us that Marine Corps General Jason Bohm is coming out with a new book on Washington's Marines. Well, that's something I want to get. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Bob Wong has a couple questions, as he usually has good ones. He asks, what state besides New Jersey did not have Marines?
Delaware.
Delaware.
Yeah, so the two Delaware River states didn't have Marines, whereas Pennsylvania did.
Huh. After the first Battle of Trenton, the Hessian prisoners, all 900, were sent to Philadelphia.
Yes.
Do we know how many American troops were sent to guard them and depleted Washington's forces?
No, it wasn't a lot. I forget. It was just like, the Hessian, where were they going to go? So it was like an honor guard, really. And when they got to Philadelphia, they were, booed and cheered, and they ended up being dispersed in the mainly around Lancaster and up in Reading area where there were large German populations.
So I'm going to ask everybody now to unmute. If you want to ask Joe a question or have a comment, you can go down to the lower left corner of your Zoom screen, and you might see where it says mute. You'll see a little microphone. If there's a red line across it, just click on it and it'll go away, and you should be able to ask your questions.
A couple of things that I forgot to mention.
Okay.
That Captain Johann Ewald, who was a Hessian officer who kept a diary, and whenever you read anything about the revolution, you always talk about Captain Ewald. He had mentioned in his diary that the defensive position that Washington took is what Colonel Rahl should have taken when Washington first attacked Trenton. So Rahl tried to protect the whole town or the village at that time, whereas Ewald said, no, Rahl should have done what Washington did and set up on the southern bank of the Assunpink. And one last thing, General Cadwalader here had wrote a letter in January 5th saying that the Americans start pulling out about 1 a.m. and wasn't until about 5 that the rear guard started following them along the way.
Great. What questions do we have from the audience today?
What happened to the French officer that abandoned Colonel Hand?
I've tried to find out. Nothing happened at the time, and eventually he just went back to France. They kind of got tired of his act, and but it's amazing. Like when you read, you go on, you Google his name, and you see not much said about him, and he stayed maybe a year or so, and then he just faded away.
Joe, he was eventually part of the Ticonderoga campaign, and there's an argument that he set his headquarters on fire accidentally and gave away the American evacuation from Ticonderoga. There's some argument about that, but he also was pushed to get promoted to Major General, and the Congress finally, he said, promote me or I'll leave. And they finally said, okay, goodbye.
Okay, leave.
I discovered, you mentioned the prisoners going to Lancaster. Just recently discovered that all the officers pretty much were segregated from the enlisted men and sent down to near Meade in Dumfries, Virginia, and were kept there until they were exchanged a year or so later. The Johannes Shams Historical Association has done some really interesting work in tracing those officers and their experiences in Virginia. And I like the presentation very much. I have one suggestion, perhaps. You may want to take a look at your picture of Hugh Mercer, or John Haslett, rather. I think that was William Alexander that you had up on the screen.
Yeah, I'll have to go back and look at that. Thank you.
You're quite welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, we had a couple of raised hands. I saw Bob Wong had a question, and then Bill Traubel. So Bob, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I have. I agree with Bill Welsh. That's a picture of Lord Sterling or William Alexander, not John Haslett. The question I had for you has to do. This is a general question. I haven't been able to find the answer to this question. The British had the sterling and treasure in New Brunswick, and I asked the local historical society where it was kept, and they guessed that it was kept in some soldiers' barracks where it would be well protected. But does anyone know exactly where that silver and sterling was kept in New Brunswick?
I don't know. Like I said, I just read, that's where they kept it, and maybe somebody has some further information. I don't.
The town jail.
Maybe. I'm not sure what is really known about that treasury that was kept there. It's an interesting question. Maybe it's a legend and maybe it's real. It's hard to know. Hey, Bill Traubel.
Thank you.
Yes. Thanks, Bob. First of all, I'm Bill Traubel, and I've only been on one of these Zooms with the roundtable. I'm very impressed with what you do, and it was an excellent presentation. And it's led to several questions that I need to look up because I am a historic interpreter at both parks. Also, I'm a trustee on the Swan Historical Foundation and the Washington Crossing Park, Jersey. So the three things I want to say that I think are germane because I am a historic interpreter, and I know that all of us give pretty much the same pitch. So one of the things was the map that in 1777, it showed a turnpike, which you said is a Princeton pike today. And from everything I've read and heard, that didn't exist at the time. Yes. And actually, it's an interesting point because we point that out to people. The other side of that road and on the ridge line is where the Mallwood was and Mallwood was and so forth. So I think that's just another one of the map issues you have.
Yeah, that map was taken by Benson Losing from the 1830s and all. And I when I first saw that, I didn't think that that turnpike was there then.
Yeah, the pike was built in 1807.
Yeah, I was going to say that was built later, and he just included it in. And again, today it's called the Princeton Pike as you come from Princeton to Trenton.
Well, the next thing is you mentioned dense woodlands. Roger Williams and I talk about a lot of things where we don't always see things the same. And one is the terrain at the time, the openness of the fields or the dense terrain. And it's really hard to picture what it really was. So that's something that I think we could all try to get a better handle on. And maybe that's something to have a presentation later. But the most cogent thing is you said that Greene on the original crossing crossed at Yardley. Wow, that's first I've heard that. And it's very significant because in 1777, CWP, never said who it was, but we assume that's Charles Wilson Peale, did a sketch of that ferry, and it shows a cable operated ferry. And in giving the tours, both in Jersey and Pennsylvania, we like to emphasize the significance of the ferries, but more importantly, we've recently been highlighting the fact that it was a cable operated ferry. Now, maybe it wasn't. Maybe if all the artillery crossed with Greene at Yardley. I have never heard that before.
Well, again, this is the second crossing. I didn't say the first. I didn't know where he crossed at the first.
Okay, well, okay, that's significant. I think it was, we were talking about the first in the presentation at that point. Well, that's great. So again, thank you so much for a wonderful briefing. Like I say, it's leading me to do a little digging on other topics. Like, I've always thought that Colonel Rawl died after the battle. And that gets to the question whether or not he found a note in his clothing with his soldiers. But you said he died in 1777.
No, he died after the battle.
Yeah, no, I didn't. No.
Yeah, he died after the battle, Bill.
Okay, somewhere in your presentation.
No, I was talking about Hugh Mercer.
Ah, okay.
Mercer took 9 days before, he was bayoneted, but it was 9 days before he died.
Right, okay.
I didn't mention Rawl at all.
Okay. Oh, okay. I thought you did. Oh, I misunderstood. Great, thank you.
We have some other questions or comments.
Where is Washington getting his supplies from? He's operating in the middle of winter, so he can't really forage. But he's, almost gone 5 days and thinking of striking at Brunswick, which is 25 miles from Trenton. Where is he getting 2 meals a day for the troops and re-ammunition and gunpowder and all that kind of stuff?
Anybody have my only thing I could think of is that what they captured at Trenton from the Hessians.
I could speak to that. Besides Newtown, Washington had magazines set up over in Allentown also. You mentioned Joseph Reed. Joseph Reed was a signer of a deed in August of 1774 regarding the Allentown Mill, where it transferred ownership from a John Ray to a Robert Ray. They were brothers, and John Ray was a wealthy Philadelphia merchant. And the third brother, David Ray, would be a hero at the Battle of Monmouth. But the Allentown Mill was owned by the Council of safety for Philadelphia throughout the war, beginning in August of 1774. In fact, they solicited grain and money for the blockade in Boston at that time. And it was Joseph Reed was a lead signer of a deed that still exists in the Allentown Borough Hall that was restored by the sons of the colonial wars.
They were also getting some provisions that were crossed over from Hunterdon County at Coryell's Ferry and brought down the river. This was before the first crossing.
All right, thank you both.
Some other questions? Well, I would like to share something with you if I can figure out how to do it. Oh, there we go. Good. My back to my PowerPoint here. We talked about our friend Joe. I just would like to share with you a couple of upcoming topics and events. For our roundtable in March, we don't have a location or time yet, or the date, but I'm going to be talking about the HMS Roebuck, which was a frigate in service for the British Navy that had a number of really interesting encounters in the North River, the Hudson River, down here in the South River, the Delaware River, and along the coast. So I'm going to be talking about that in March. I'm having fun researching it. And then in June, Michael C. Harris is going to talk to us about the Battle of Germantown. Michael recently had 2 books published, one about the Battle of Brandywine and another excellent book about the Battle of Germantown. We're going to be looking for speakers for next September and December. So if you've got a topic that you're working on and might be willing to talk to our group, please let me know. Also coming up, Roger Williams, who's with us, has got an event coming up next Tuesday evening at, I believe it's 7:30. Roger, can you say something about that for us?
Sure. Dr. Frederica Baer, who wrote what I think is the definitive book at this point on the Hessians, is coming on History Author Talks next Tuesday. So I'm looking forward to having Dr. Baer. The book is terrific for any of you who it's terrific and it's expensive. I think it's like $79, but it's a really remarkable piece of work, and it really does round out a lot of the information that we didn't see in some of the earlier books that have been written about on the Hessians.
Yeah. Hey, and people can find out more at your website. Is it historyauthortalks.com?
History Author Talks. And Rob, can I just say one other thing I have coming up?
Please, yes.
Only because I'm just tickled pink about this. Larry Kidder and I do the tours of the 10 Crucial Days. And on January 7th, the day before the reenactment of the Battle of Princeton, we're doing one of our bus tours. On that bus tour on January 7th, aforementioned General Jason Bowen, the United States Marine Corps, he's the Inspector General of the Marine Corps, is going to be on that tour with us. Also on that tour with us are going to be 3 British officers from the Royal Lancers. This is the legacy unit of the 16th Light Dragoons. They're flying over from London to be with us on the day of the reenactment of the Battle of Princeton when we do our wreath layings. We have representatives from many of the legacy units that fought in the battle that day. Oh. So I'm going to be giving a tour to these British officers about these battles. It's really cool.
And can people sign up for that tour?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you go, they're based out of the Pennsylvania Park. So if you go to, if you just go to 10crucialdays.org, that'll lead you to the tours.
Great. Roger mentioned the reenactment that's going to take place on the 8th at Princeton, and that's going to be between 9:30 and 1. I think the reenactment begins at 10, and you can get more information about that from PBS 1777. That's the Princeton Battlefield Society, 1777. Also, on the New Jersey side, on December 11th, from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m., we're going to have Washington's Landing in New Jersey. So this is going to take place in the New Jersey-Washington Crossing Park, where the Swan Historical Foundation collection is located. And this is going to be right down by the river, right in the location where we're expecting the state of New Jersey to build a new visitors center for us, which they think will probably break ground about this time next year and maybe take about 2 years to complete. But Washington's Landing in New Jersey. So what's going to be happening on the other side of the river, Pennsylvania side, they're going to be doing a rehearsal for the crossing. They're going to have guys in uniforms and all getting in the boats and coming across. And this event will take place where they're going to be landing on the Jersey side. And there are a number of reenactor units are going to be there. In particular, the group that reenacts the later Rhode Island regiment, the 1st Rhode Island. So this should be kind of exciting as well. I think that's about all that I have for you, but I'd like you to know that we have, oh, I didn't have it here. Oh, well, we have, we will take the recording from this event and I'll be editing it and putting it up on our YouTube site in about 3 weeks. And also you can go and see more about our roundtable at the Swan Historical Foundation website. I thought I had those on this slide, but I don't. Sorry. But you should see them in the invite, the links to those places in the invite that I sent you originally for this meeting. So we hope you'll be able to join us for some of our future meetings. Thanks very much. Any other comments or questions before we go?
Good job.
Actually, thank you. Good
I
program.
actually have one question I thought of. I grew up in Griggstown, and Griggstown is famous. The only really claim to fame we have is about John Honeyman.
I knew that was coming.
Sorry, Roger. And I just doing some research for this meeting because it's been so long since I really studied any of this stuff. It seems like he supposedly had something to do with the distraction of the British for the Battle of Trenton. But there's also a lot of, I'm sorry, Roger, I apologize. It's been a long time since we've seen each other. I don't even know if you remember me, but
I do.
But I was just curious, you know, what we've always known growing up there, we always heard such stories about him being this famous spy. What's the story with that? What's he really? Did he do anything? Did he just get rich off somehow and have money to burn for years?
He was there. He was one of many. You know, it's great family. I mean, this is from the research that I've done. Look, Honeyman was there. He certainly was one of many that Washington relied on for information. The story overall is, I think, overblown in terms of his import. It's an amalgamation of what we know from many sources of information that Washington was getting. So, I mean, you know, others disagree with that. I'd be curious to get definitive research other than to family lore.
Pete, I believe that the CIA has a presentation on seriously on Honeyman on their website. I can't remember what it all suggests, but take a look at the CIA website and check it.
Thanks, I definitely will. It's always been kind of a moment of curiosity for anybody in town, or if you want to call it a town. All 1,000 of us that grew up there.
All due respect to Griggstown.
Yeah, well, there's no need for that. That's okay.
Well, let me say thank you so much to Joe for an excellent presentation. And thanks
Joe.
to all of you for attending and for your really insightful comments and questions.